After Ferguson, Cleveland, and Staten Island, Baltimore. A one-week curfew, the National Guard deployed, firefighters still battling blazes from overnight, all after riots that followed the funeral of a 25-year-old black man who died of a spinal injury when taken into police custody 9 days ago. Anger boiling over before city officials had finished their probe into Anthony Gray's arrest and the 30-minute police van ride that followed. After last summer's riots in Ferguson, a suburb of St. Louis, Gray's death rekindling public outcry over police treatment of African Americans. This time, the looting and rioting happening just 40 miles north of the U.S. Capitol. We're going to look at the specifics of Baltimore, a southern industrial port city where nearly 2/3 of the population is black, and with the Justice Department also investigating what's being done at the federal level to prevent future race riots and to build trust where so many argue it's never existed before. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Baltimore burning, and with us from Baltimore, France 24 correspondent Philip Crowther. Also joining us here in the studio, filmmaker and campaigner with Democrats Abroad, Zachary Miller. Nice to have you back. Welcome back as well to former journalist Ricky Stevenson. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Also joining us, political scientist Mathieu Zadgrodzki, and your work focusing on policing. And interesting to have your take, because in this country, there's a discussion going on as well about what's the best way to advance when it comes to policing. And we're pleased to welcome Chanel Jones from Columbus, Ohio. Chanel teaches at Ohio Dominican University, also a criminologist. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate. The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, our hashtag F24debate. Nearly 200 arrests. Schools closed this Tuesday in Baltimore. Buildings still smoldering. The U.S. president has been speaking about it in the last few minutes. But before we hear him, let's cross to Philip Crowther, who is in Baltimore. And Philip, I should say you're in front of a sort of a familiar setting to people around the world, because people know the TV series The Wire, and you're outside of the police headquarters there.
Yeah, and it's not just that TV series that people are thinking of right now. It shows a lot of urban plight. Baltimore has a lot of urban plight. And you mentioned President Obama just now. He said in the Rose Garden of the White House just now that he believes this is a problem that's been around for decades. And what he means is urban plight and joblessness in areas, like many areas in Baltimore in this case. But also, what is happening here at this precise moment, it reminds us, and me personally, of what I saw in Ferguson only last year in in August and in November, during two series of rioting in that suburb of St. Louis, because we've got a similar setup here right now. You've got long lines of riot police, and you've got the National Guard now also getting involved. The National Guard of Maryland is now here on the ground. We're not being told exactly how many. It could be up to 5,000. That many members of the National Guard could potentially be deployed in the city of Baltimore. And they, along with the police forces here in Baltimore, are supposed to bring calm to the streets here, the contrary to what happened yesterday. But just one reminder of what happened yesterday. The violence began at 4 p.m. in the afternoon. That is very early indeed, especially if we make the comparison with Ferguson, where riots and looting only happened after nightfall at around 8 or 9 p.m. That was worrying yesterday. And also what was worrying is that rioting and looting spread throughout the city of Baltimore, not only in the western part of the city where the funeral for Freddie Gray took place yesterday, but also to here, to downtown. That is why just across the street from here, I'm seeing National Guard members protecting City Hall. They are here to protect what the police department calls critical infrastructure.
Protect critical infrastructure. Philip, earlier we were speaking with one of the editors of the Baltimore Sun, the crime editor there, who said he's never seen anything like it in Baltimore, and yet there are neighborhoods where life is going on as usual.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, that's bound to happen. But this is a city that has really felt what happened yesterday. Again, I mean, this violence spread yesterday, and so did the looting. We walked around large parts of the city and drove around large parts of the city, and when we were just looking to our left and to our right, we weren't expecting to see anything extraordinary. But all of a sudden, you saw people just walking in and out of corner stores, of supermarkets, of gas stations, casually looting, just walking in and taking stuff and taking it back home with them. That was happening almost citywide, and some of the destruction is also citywide. What we're seeing here today are a lot of burnt out buildings. It hasn't happened all around the city, but there are burnt out homes, there are burnt out supermarkets, and it doesn't look good for the city of Baltimore. This is, of course, the worst violence Baltimore has seen since 1968. There were race riots here as well back then, and there is still a feeling that some of the animosity, so to say, from 1968 still is present in some parts of the city. There's a lot of urban plight in Baltimore. Where this violence happened, some of these are areas where there is almost extreme joblessness, and you're seeing a lot of buildings boarded up. Simply, there aren't that many people living in some of these areas. That is how bad it has become.
Philip Crowther, you covered, of course, the riots in that St. Louis suburb of Ferguson last summer. What are the similarities, but also what are the differences?
Well, the big difference is we're looking at a pretty big city here, and you're looking at the possibility of riots and looting throughout the city. That's what happened yesterday. We do have to talk, though, about the number of people who were involved, and I think that is a similarity. In Ferguson, we saw a small group of rioters. These were largely peaceful protests, after all. In Ferguson, that turned violent at certain moments, and these were small groups, and critics would say these were groups that came from the outside. In other words, these were not inhabitants of the city of Ferguson itself. That is what people are saying about the riots here in Baltimore as well. But there is less belief here that that is true. Remember, for example, yesterday there was a clear threat that the police department talked about, a threat that different gang members were getting together here, gang members from the city of Baltimore, and that they were going to attack the police of Baltimore. That might have happened. Obviously, the people we speak to in the street here will not identify themselves as gang members, but you've got a difference there between the two. The clearest similarity, though, today is what we're seeing on the streets here in terms of police lines, riot police, and with them the National Guard. That is something I wasn't expecting to see again after leaving Ferguson in November, but it is a very similar picture to what we saw back then that is happening right now here in Baltimore.
Many thanks, Philip Crowther, reporting from central Baltimore outside of the police headquarters. And let's get the reaction now from our panel. Ricky Stevens.
I'm actually angered by his reporting. I find it offensive. Why can't these be called protesters? There were 10,000 people in Baltimore who protested, and they're protesting the murder of Freddie Gray, but also the murder of epidemic murder of a string of unarmed black men and children. Young man, 17 years old. This is a protest. There are pockets of those who would take advantage of the situation, but I think this whole skew,
but Ricky, as we're speaking, the fire department is still putting out fires from last night.
I know they are, but why did they not talk about the 10,000 people who marched? I know this area. My father-in-law lived across the street from Mondawmin Mall. He was a vice principal at Frederick Douglass High School, and it's a black community. It's a peaceful, fairly prosperous black community. People want to know that they can walk down the street in peace and not be shot and killed. And I think that the fact that that is being ignored, that the protest, the anger, the outrage, that every 28 hours a unarmed black man is shot and killed, is just being ignored here.
All right, let's hear the take of the U.S. President Barack Obama speaking a short while ago. He says there's no excuse for the violence in Baltimore.
The violence that happened yesterday distracted from the fact that you had seen multiple days of peaceful protests that were focused on entirely legitimate concerns of these communities in Baltimore, led by clergy and community leaders, and they were constructive and they were thoughtful. and frankly didn't get that much attention.
Zachary Miller, nonetheless, I mean, we're talking about the worst night of rioting since 1968 in that city.
Yeah, and I think that's a cause for concern from everybody, and I think it requires everyone's attention, and oftentimes you don't get attention until there's something like this. Now, whether we call it a riot or a protest, it had been peaceful protesting for a number of days. And, I want to also talk about why people protest. I want to get to the root of the problem. What's the root cause? And the root cause is that they are unheard. And I want to just give a little quote by Martin Luther King. He said, "It is not enough for me to stand before you tonight and condemn riots. It would be morally irresponsible for me to do that without the same time condemning the contingent, intolerable conditions that exist in our society. These conditions are the things that cause individuals to feel that they have no other alternative than to engage in violent rebellions to get attention. And I must say tonight that riot is the language of the unheard." Martin Luther King said that just weeks before he died.
Yeah, riot, the language of the unheard, but how do you react when you hear our reporter talking about people walking casually into stores and looting?
It's awful, and it's awful because it's their own community. They're harming the people that they are neighbors with. That's the frustration. As a psychologist, I look at things, seeing the psychological reasons for people to do things. Sometimes adolescents cut themselves. They're harming themselves, but that's a way for them to express the anger and the frustration they're feeling. So in the same way, riots can be attributed in that same manner, that they are expressing concern about the constant fear they live in from the police, the constant poverty or the gloomy outlook of the unemployment situation, all of these things. This incident, this murder, on top of all the other murders, is a tipping point, a boiling point, if you will, to why these things are happening. And it's not just happening to African Americans. I think it's happening to all Americans.
Chanel Jones?
Yeah, I would say I agree. And I'm getting a little tired of hearing the Dr. Martin Luther King quote. But, the reality of the situation is when people riot, when they engage in civil unrest, civil disobedience, however you may want to call it, that is typically not the result of one incident. That is the culmination of several incidents that all have boiled up to a point where people just are upset. And so they act out, so they riot, so they destroy property. And we need to move beyond the physical, just looking at the destruction of the property and understanding that, there's a deeper meaning to this. And if you take the situation that happened in Baltimore, the situation that happened in New York, the situation that happened in Florida, we can go on and on and on and on. There are countless African-American men who are constantly targeted, they're racially profiled, and they are brutalized by the police officer. And then add on to that layer that we rarely see any form of accountability for these officers. So people have reached the point where they are just sick and tired of being sick and tired. And the way that they act out on their rage, this is what we are seeing is rage, is to burn buildings down because they are bringing attention to their plight. And they have no other way else to do it. I mean, there may be some other ways, but this is the course of action that they're taking at this point.
There are also a lot of people injured, and there was police officers among the injured. Chanel, let me ask you, how is the story being reported, in your view, where you are in the United States?
Well, we're getting several different frames, I guess you would call it, for the way that the story is being reported. Some of the narratives look at the violence that has been inflicted. I think there were 15 officers that were actually injured. Some of them were hospitalized because of the attack, which is not, we don't want to see violence. Violence is never okay. But what's not being said also is the hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of African Americans who, men and women, mothers and sons, children who have been killed or hurt by the police officers. And not only if we can look on the national scale in the U.S., but if we just close in on Baltimore alone, they have awarded over the last 5 years somewhere around $5.7 million in settlements and judgments. That's taxpayer dollars because of what the police has done to the community. So I think they're just at a point where they're upset. Last year, I think about the last 4 years, there have been somewhere around 100 individuals who have had issues with the police where they have been brutalized by them. So, this problem is systemic with the Baltimore Police Department, but it's not just in the Baltimore Police Department, it's reflective of the greater society that we have here in America. And so we're seeing these two narratives, some framing it around the plight of African Americans, some framing it around, the hardships. I mean, policing is not an easy job. Law enforcement is no easy task. We know that. And there needs to be some reconciliation where we have the police and the community coming together to solve crime, collaboratively and cooperatively. And we need that. And, the violence is bringing attention to the problem. But we need to move past the violence and get to the root cause of the issue and then start addressing that. And that starts with repairing police-community relations.
Mathieu Zadrowski, 3 issues I see here. There's race relations, there's policing, and poverty.
Right. I don't know where to start with this whole thing, with all those incidents and killings. There's obviously a race problem. 32% of the people killed in America every year by law enforcement officers are actually African Americans, whereas only 12% of the total population in America is actually African Americans. So it's a disproportionate amount of killings perpetrated on African Americans. There's obviously a policing issue. There are contradicting trends. There have been contradicting trends in American policing over the past 20 or 30 years. On the one hand, you have more and more community policing, community relations. Many large American cities like Chicago, like LA, embrace community policing as a style of, managing relations with citizens on the daily basis. On the other hand, you see more and more military style type of policing, with almost all American police departments having police paramilitary units, SWAT type of units that are meant to handle hostage situations, but that actually, for the most part, are serving arrest warrants or just patrolling the communities, which is not their job, and they're doing that with
Can be perceived as a provocation.
Exactly. The people in the communities see that as over-policing and as being invaded by a sort of army that is completely outside of the community.
When we come back, I'll ask you and the rest of the panel about the specifics of Baltimore when it comes to this. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.